Welcome back to La Neta. My name is Ben Waddell. In today's episode, we're going to be looking at international migration, but we're not going to be looking at the impact that migrants have on the places they arrive to, but rather the places that they come from. You know the drill. La Neta is about breaking down truths. We lay the facts on the tables. We take important issues of the day and we think about them through the lens of the truth, through the lens of facts. So when we think about migration, we most frequently think about people coming from underdeveloped countries to highly developed countries, right? So we think of people leaving spaces that lack resources and searching for opportunity in places that have more of them. One of the largest migration trends in the 21st and the 20th century is the movement of Mexicans to the United States. More people have crossed the land border between Mexico and the United States than any other land border in the world. And so Mexican migration to the United States is of historic size. And so when we think about this, we oftentimes think about this through the lens of the impact that Mexican Americans have on the United States. But I want to flip this around. And in today's episode, I want to think about what is the impact that migrants have, and Mexicans in particular, have had on the land that they left behind. So to start things off, I want to share a quote with you, and this is by Richard Rodriguez. Now, Richard Rodriguez is a famous Mexican-American writer, and he wrote a piece in 1982, the year I was born, called Hunger of Memory: The Education of Richard Rodriguez. And this is really a book, it's a story about his own intellectual growth. Richard Rodriguez didn't speak English until he was 6. He spoke Spanish growing up, but in school he had to learn English. Well, he ended up learning it quite well. He ended up going to Stanford, Columbia, and Berkeley, and he ends up writing a great deal over the next 3 decades about life as a Mexican American in the United States. And so this quote that I'm going to share with you, I think really contextualizes the potential impact that migrants have had on their homelands, but I think it's something we don't think enough about. So here's the quote. "One of the things that Mexico had never acknowledged about my father, I insist you at least entertain the idea, is the possibility that my father and others like him were the great revolutionaries of Mexico, Pocho pioneers. They, not Pancho Villa, not Zapata, were the heralds of the modern age of Mexico. They left for the United States and they came back to Mexico and they changed it forever." Now that's something that I want you to continue to think about throughout this episode. It's the possibility that migrants not only change the spaces that they come to forever, but they also change the spaces they left. And that's what we'll be looking at. We'll be thinking specifically about how the transfers that migrants make back to their homelands change those spaces, right? And so we'll be talking about remittances. Remittances are the cash transfers of the money that migrants send back home to help their loved ones, their families, their friends within the communities they left behind. And remittances have never been as high as they are today. Remittances are at historic highs worldwide, and they're also at historic highs in Mexico. Migrant remittances have been going up in Mexico since the 1980s. They hit about 2 billion in 1990. They rise up to about 10, 11 billion in the early 2000s. And last year, Mexico received a historic high $36 billion from the United States in the form of remittances. Now, remittances outpace foreign direct investments around the world. Remittances outpace foreign aid around the world. So when it comes to development cash, when it comes to money that is aimed at improving the lives of poor people around the world, there is nothing larger than migrant remittances. Migrants are the largest agents of change within the developing world, bar none. There's no one that paces the same rate of investment within developing parts of the world as migrants do. So when we think about migrant remittances, when we think about the impact that they have within their homelands, we have to start with the foundation that it is the largest cash transfer in the history of the world from the most developed spaces to the least developed spaces. That's our point of entry. So let's jump right into it and let's get down to the facts. Alright, so migrant remittances represent the largest transfer of cash from the developed world to the developing world in the history of the world, right? And so it's a big deal. Migrant remittances are of a large magnitude and they can have a large impact within the developing world or in with areas that are resource strapped and lack the resources that more developed areas of the world have. But what is the actual impact of remittances within those spaces? Let's start with the bad news. The bad news is that as billions of dollars transfer from highly developed spaces like the United States into less developed areas of communities across Mexico and the rest of Latin America and Southeast Asia, is they have a sort of Dutch disease effect. Now, the Dutch disease is a term that actually comes from the 1970s. It was coined by the economist, and it was used to describe a situation in the Netherlands that took place in the late 1950s. Now, at that time period, the Netherlands had discovered a natural gas deposit, and they started tapping into that, and it led to the growth of national wealth. And so what happens is you start to see the growth of national wealth, which undercuts the manufacturing sector. So the manufacturing sector at the time in the Netherlands was large, but it starts to be undercut because as national development takes place, people are less willing to work at lower wages, which means they're less willing to work within manufacturing jobs. And so you get this sort of Dutch disease. That's where the term comes from, but there's also a sort of Dutch disease that starts to occur within migrant villages. So where remittances start to increase at rapid rates within migrant villages across Mexico and other parts of the world, what you see is an investment in entrepreneurialism by the families that are receiving those remittances. So they invest in small stores, they invest in the marketplace, they buy tractors to work the fields, they start doing things that they traditionally wouldn't have been able to do through the consumption that is allowed to them by the migrant remittances that they're receiving from abroad. But what this also does is it reveals a new level of consumption to everyone else in the village or the small space from which these migrants are from. And so what happens is you start to see old local industries like agriculture and working in the marketplace or manufacturing industries become undercut by the migrant remittances themselves. The local economy is developing rapidly, and it leaves a lot of people out, right? And so I've been in very rural villages in Mexico where you wake up at 5 or 6 in the morning and the only people you see going out into the fields are 60 and 70-year-old men. You don't see the young 13, 14, 15-year-old men that traditionally would have went out and worked in the fields going out with their fathers and grandfathers. In many cases, their fathers are abroad working, their grandfathers are going into the fields, but they're not participating. The reason they're not participating is because they're looking at somebody who is going out into the fields and making $5, $6 a day, and what they're seeing is the best way to get ahead in life is to go to the United States, right? And so this local market that used to exist, the subsistence agriculture market that existed in many of these places, is undercut by migrant remittances, right? So that's the bad news. The other side of the negative outcome of remittances is remittances contribute to inequality, right? And so usually, even in high migration villages, somewhere around 30-35% of the village might have migrated abroad or to a larger regional city in the country. In the case of Mexico, it's rare that you see villages where that high a number has migrated abroad. What that means is the majority of people don't migrate. It also means that the majority of people don't receive migrant remittances. And so when you look at high numbers of households receiving remittances in Mexico, in high remittance villages, you'll see 20-25% of homes receiving remittances. But that means the majority of people are left on the outside looking in. And so you get this inequality that rises within these areas. And what that contributes to is higher levels of crime, among other things, right? So inequality has a lot of negative effects within our society, but crime is one of them. Okay, so it's not all negative. Let's look at some of the positives of migrant remittances and the impact that migrants have on their homeland. One of the things that's been unique that has happened in Mexico and other countries around the world is migrants have begun to pool their resources together to help develop their hometowns, right? Most migrants leave because they're interested in helping their hometowns and their communities get ahead in life. They want to get ahead themselves, but they also want to see their towns get ahead. And so migrants are more and more frequently pooling together remittances so that they can build a bridge in their hometown, redo the church, build a new road, build a school or a water sanitation plant, right? And so you see all kinds of projects across Mexico and the rest of the developing world in which migrants are pooling their resources together with other people who have left to try and help improve the hometowns that they left from. And in recent decades, for example, in the case of Mexico, you actually see the Mexican government participating in this as well. And so there's a program called 3x1 para Migrantes, or 3-for-1 for migrants in Mexico, in which if migrants in the United States pool together money, so if 10 or 15 migrants come together and are able to raise $10,000, and they send that back to Mexico to develop a bridge or something of that nature, the Mexican government will contribute threefold on top of that amount. So a $10,000 investment by the migrants becomes a $40,000 investment because each branch of government, the municipal, state, and federal level of government, will put an additional $10,000 towards the project. And so you get this much larger impact. And migrants then have an opportunity to actually participate in local governance and help improve not only the development, the economic development of their hometowns, but also the way in which democratic governance takes place. So there's some really great news coming out of the ways in which migrants who have left their hometown communities are leveraging their access to resources abroad to try and help their communities back home. So I want to move away from this issue and jump into the story. As you know, with the Neta, every single episode has an issue. This week we're looking at international migration and the remittances that migrants send home. But I also want to think about this through the lens of a story. And so for this week, we're going to look at the story of Jorge Martinez. Okay, so Jorge Martinez and I meet back in 2009. Jorge Martinez at the time was the president of a migrant club called Ojo de Agua de Mendoza. He was from this small town in southern Guanajuato, which is in central Mexico, and his town was called Ojo de Agua de Mendoza. And so I met Jorge because I was able to locate the different presidents of hometown association clubs, these groups of migrants that have come together in the United States to try and improve their hometowns back in Mexico. And he was the president of one of these clubs, and he happened to live in Albuquerque, where I was doing my dissertation work at the University of New Mexico. And so I called up Jorge and I said, hey, can we sit down and talk about your story and how you got into this? And he said, yeah, of course. And so we met up at Pro's Ranch. We met in the food court, and we sat down and we started, kind of hashing through how he got into this work. Turns out that Jorge, in the 1980s, was looking at his town. He was a young boy, and he was trying to figure out how he was going to get ahead in life. And what he saw was his uncles and his grandfathers and his family members and his neighbors. Most people had gotten ahead, had gone to the United States. And so Jorge decides in the early 1990s to go to the United States. In 1991, he gets to Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he starts working for Loyola's Family Restaurant, which is up on Central in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He's been working there ever since. For many years, Jorge sends money back. He helps his mom with her store, so she has a small store that she was able to open up in his hometown. And he helps his brother with a small tortilla factory, which he still runs today. He builds himself a house, which has a 2-car garage, kind of the idea of a U.S. house, but in the middle of nowhere, Mexico. But then he starts thinking larger. He told me, I was back home. I go home every year, at least once. I try to go back. And I'm sitting there and I'm talking with one of my family members, and I said, I want to do something bigger. I want to have a larger impact on my hometown. And he said, the roads are really bad. What if we improve the roads? And so the next day, Jorge jumps in his truck and he goes with some other guys, and they go and they load up some gravel and cement, and they come back to their town and they start trying to redo the road, literally by themselves redo the road. And the municipal delegate comes along, the guy who represents the small town in front of the municipal presidency, which is kind of like the mayorship, right? And so this local mayor-like fellow comes along and he says, Jorge, why don't you work with me? We have this 3-for-1 for migrants program. We can contribute to your funds. But Jorge goes, I just didn't really trust the Mexican government, right? That's why I left in part. And so he says, okay, no, that's fine. We'll keep working. So he keeps working. And so finally, when he's getting ready to go home, the delegate goes, well, why don't you go to your Mexican consulate up in Albuquerque and ask them about it? And Jorge said, I trusted them. They'd help me through my documentation. They'd help me through my residency, my citizenship. I trusted them, right? I trusted them to help me with this issue. So I went to them and we set up our first 3-for-1 project. And so I raised money alongside many other people from Ojo de Agua de Mendoza, people living in Nebraska and California and other parts of the United States, set money to contribute to developing more roads within the hometown. And so we pulled that money together, we ran it through the 3-for-1 program, we got the expertise of engineers and architects in Mexico alongside the Mexican government to develop our project in a professional way. And now they've done several projects like this, right? But that's kind of the basic story of how this works. Jorge is an example of thousands of people across Mexico who have migrated to the United States and are now pooling their money together to help develop their hometowns. Now, the good news is that this has had a deep impact on many towns across Mexico. The bad news is that the 3-for-1 program really is a very small percentage of remittances. In Guanajuato, it's less than 1%. Across Mexico, that's true as well. It captures a very, very small percentage of the actual flows of remittances into Mexico. So the majority of remittances continue going to conspicuous consumption and oftentimes aren't directly involved in helping develop hometowns. So that brings us to La Neta. All right, we've reached the end of this episode. As you know, every single week with La Neta, we look at an issue, which this week is international migration and migrant remittances. Then we look at a story. This week we looked at the story of Jorge Martinez. And then we come to La Neta, the truth. We lay the facts on the table and we try and make sense of the world a little bit with a little more clarity. And this week, what I want you to take home, the message that I want you to sit with, is that migrants are agents of change in today's world. Migrants are, in fact, the main agent for change in the developing world. Beyond the World Bank, beyond the International Monetary Fund, beyond foreign aid, right, that places like the United States spend around the world through USAID and other branches of governments, beyond all of those organizations, there is no group of people that invest more in the developing world today than migrants. Migrants send more money home than all of those entities, right? They're sending billions of dollars every single year back to the places that they're from to try and help the people that are left behind leverage and access basic health care, access to education, and access to income that they need to live dignified lives. And so, if we want to improve the lives of people in the developing world, what we need to do is work alongside migrants. We need to learn from migrants. We need to work through migrants. And we need to support the efforts that they're already doing. That's La Neta for this week. I hope you've enjoyed the episode. I look forward to seeing you in future episodes.